So when I was asked to come and talk to you about creativity in a kind of an uncertain context, well, what did I do? So I went and started listening to people. I started reading in a slightly different way, I suppose, with new ears. And you'd be forgiven for thinking that we were going through a period of what can only be described as immense and tumultuous, often, changes with, you only have to read the newspaper with Brexit and, an erosion of trust, for example, in brands and the way media is perceived, to think that, we're going through a pretty difficult time and certainly a time of great levels of uncertainty. It's a bit of a cliche, but even Moore's Law has kind of come in for a bit of stick in terms of its ability to keep up with the pace of change. But, we all know that change is nothing new, and I thought this quote was brilliant. It really kind of nailed that sentiment. And this is a quote that wasn't said, last week or even in the last 50 years. This is a quote that was first captured in 500 years before the birth of Christ by a dude called Heraclitus. So, he knew then that there's nothing new about change. But I think for us, there's a very human dimension to that pace of change, that unrelenting pace of change. And this is some data that I've gathered from various sources, looking at the average tenure of the UK CEO, comparing that, how it's changed in the last few years. And you can see people are getting ever shorter opportunities to experiment, to challenge, to change, and indeed to fail before they're moved on. And I think that's not just the same for CEOs, but it's the same for us in the marketing framework. And you'll see on there, in the white, the average tenure of agency employees, and that's data from the IPA. I mean, we're not yet at the scale where the UK football manager is, but it actually shows you that we get less opportunity than ever to deal with that world of uncertainty. And if you're on the outside of the industry looking in, and one of the biggest challenges we all face is about how we continue to attract talent to our industry as marketers or to the media industries more broadly. And this is some data that shows that marketing as a discipline it has a reputation that is not going to be there to attract vast numbers of interest from new people coming in. So actually, this does actually cause us a broader problem, a culture of uncertainty where people are talking a lot in corridors about the pace of change and how do we keep up and, what's going to happen here. And it starts to fuel, I suppose, if we're not careful, the idea of pessimism. And this is some information looking at the pessimism of different populations. And you can see overwhelmingly that people tend towards a more pessimistic outlook. And you can see countries like China are a little bit more balanced, but certainly the UK is not alone in having a population that sees the world in a negative way. And why is this important to us? From my point of view, as somebody who works in an agency and leads teams and is trying to influence people, it's very easy for pessimistic viewpoints, negative viewpoints, to become almost like viral. It becomes the way that we see the world, and it's not always unhelpful. There's nothing like a disaster news agenda to get people together, to get people talking, and I think it does depend on, though, what it is that you're reading and the integrity and the rigor of the sources that you put to play. And I think that's one of the things that, that we are all battling as marketeers and as news brands, is about the filter bubble that social and technology has created around human beings, where you only see the world through the lens of the algorithm that tells you that is the stuff that you're personally into. And obviously confirmation bias, which is, I see an idea, it kind of gains momentum and it becomes fact, it becomes the norm, and then you filter everything else that you see through that lens. If you have a pessimistic view of change or of uncertainty, then it will lend you to see the world in that particular way. But this doesn't necessarily have to be a problem for news brands. And I think, you'd have to have been living in a cave not to see some of the flack that the media and news brands per se have come into, in the last year, whether it's, allegations about fake news, alternative facts. This is some data about governmental interference, perceived governmental interference into things like the media and elections. I mean, you'd be sat there going, Christ, there's no wonder that we feel the world is uncertain. We could adopt a very pessimistic view. But I'd like to, from my point of view, I think it's actually the opposite. I think fake news could be actually the best thing that's happened to traditional news brands and news media. And why, you might say? Because it will force, the audience, the reader, whatever format, to question what it is they're reading, the integrity, the rigour, the ethics of the brands that they choose to go for their news. So rather than just assuming that everything that's pumped out there, whether it's a blogger, an everyman journalist, or a major national newspaper, is real, the fact that somebody like Trump says about fake news says it has to lend a question and make readers a lot more searching and questioning, I suppose, about the quality and the integrity of the places they go to. And that can only be a good thing for marketers and brands who place themselves in those media. And this is some of the latest trust data. So you can see the top. You can see, arguably say, traditional media, it's kind of, it's all over and it's everybody, nobody trusts traditional media anymore. But I think this is probably indicative of what I'm just talking about, is that because people are being forced to question the integrity of the media choices they're making, that actually traditional media has an advantage because of its ethics, because of the rigour, which is inevitably applied to what is produced every day by news brands and other forms of news media. From my point of view, I work for an advertising agency. I look at the fourth estate and I say it's so important for us to protect the integrity of this, not just for, because it's the foundation of democracy, that's my own personal view, but also because it impacts on the integrity of news brands as environments into which to place brands. And the integrity that the audience has and the relationship that they have with a news brand is then a reflection of their perception of your ability to curate the commercial messages that turn up in that environment. There's no surprise that a brand like Pears back in the day, this is a very, famously one of the first and most long-standing brands used news media. Why do they use news media? Because guess what? People go there for stuff what is new. If you've got an audience who is using a particular media form because it's the place to go to find out about what is new and what is the newest truth that's available, if you put your brand and your commercial message, guess what? What you're saying, you've basically got an audience who's ready for the newest of the new. And so from an editorial point of view, it's always had a fantastic relationship. So if we need to kind of protect, I suppose, the integrity, the journalistic and editorial integrity of news brands, in this context, to enable us to continue to have a meaningful commercial relationship and to enable audiences to trust in the messages that we put out. I think there's a responsibility there for us as people producing the commercial messages that go into those spaces to make sure that they live up to that standard. We need creativity within that environment. But the problem that I see very often is that uncertainty psychologically has an impact on the individual and on the brain. And many studies have shown that if you put somebody or a set of human guinea pigs into an uncertain context, they will be much more likely to choose the practical solution. And that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? If you're unsure about the future or unsure about your situation, you're much more likely to adopt the practical solution rather than creative. And what actually happens in the brain is that it kicks in a fear of failure and also avoidance behaviours. So avoidance behaviours are you trying to protect yourself. And so it sort of goes some way to explain why people so often talk about the fact, that they want, I want the most creative idea. But then somehow, at the end of the day, they often reject the most creative idea. And this is Marcel Duchamp's famous fountain sculpture, which is an upturned urinal. Now, this was created in 1917, so I don't know how many people did history like I did, but 1917 was a particularly tumultuous year. It was towards the end of the First World War. Revolution was bubbling in, across Europe, including places like, obviously, Russia at the time. Now, this idea was presented to the Society of Independent Artists, and luckily, Marcel had managed to get a photograph of it. Unfortunately, the directors of that society decided that it wasn't the kind of creativity they were looking for and put it in a back room. And then what happened was some clever sod threw it away. So it actually was never exhibited. And the only place that this now exists is in this photograph. And even replicas actually sell for millions. And it's arguably one of the most important pieces of conceptual sculpture of the last century. You can see how uncertainty can easily drive us to take the less creative route. And this is why I think it's so important as clients and as agency people and as media owners that we build our courage and our bravery to continue to answer uncertainty with creativity. And, that takes commitment and courage on all parts. And I've just got a couple of examples here, which I'm sure you're familiar with, taken from news media campaigns, both for KFC, and one really responding to the environment, the news environment with the apology, but also equally, able to put forward very simple and strong consumer propositions. So it takes bravery, creative bravery in that sort of context. So that got me thinking as a planner, why are some individuals and some organisations, why do they get away with this? How are they able to thrive in this world of uncertainty whilst other people and other organisations really struggle? So I had a look into some research, and there was a guy called Dr. Seligman in the 50s, 60s and 70s who did a lot of research around learned helplessness. I don't know whether you've come across that. So that's the idea that why do some individuals are able to get themselves out of a sticky situation, whereas others sort of almost like curl up into a ball and allow it to happen. Now, he did a lot of work with the US Army to understand why some people succeed in certain situations and other people fail and struggle to cope. And what he found was it's got absolutely sod all to do with the level of motivation of an individual, and it's got nothing to do with the ability of an individual. It had everything to do with one single factor, and I suppose this comes to the crux of what I wanted to talk about, which was optimism. So he found in many, many studies that the thing that differentiated between success and failure was this idea of optimism. Now, we're all familiar with what optimism is. It's the kind of belief that, or the feeling that you can succeed. It is possible to find a way, and it's possible to succeed. And it just struck me how important that is to retain our optimism in the kind of business that we're in, when it's not predictable. As marketeers, we're trying to change businesses, we're trying to change people's behavior, we're trying to come up with creative ideas. It's not easy to do that. We're going to fail, we're going to have to learn, we're going to have to pick ourselves up sometimes and ask ourselves the difficult questions. And, if we surround ourselves and allow a culture of pessimism or a culture of uncertainty to surround us, it will only become much, much harder to do that. But also I found that optimism actually has a commercial value. There's a guy called Schulman who did some research amongst insurance salesmen. And he found that insurance salesmen who were optimistic in nature actually sold not just 5% more, but they sold 35% more policies than their more pessimistic colleagues. So there was a very tangible benefit to optimism within a sales context. And in fact, he also found that they were half as likely to quit in the first year. So there's a human resources opportunity to look for and to nurture optimism, both at an individual level, but also at an organisational or even team level. And it really started me to think about how do I, as a business leader or a team leader, encourage optimism in my people and in our organisation against what are often feels like unsurmountable odds. For me, coming from the creative side, optimism is also absolutely critical within the process, I suppose, of coming up with ideas. I have to believe when I'm faced with the blank page that I have the skills and ability to fill the blank page with something that's at least half meaningful. What optimism does actually in the brain is it counteracts some of the avoidance behaviours, it neutralises some of the fear of uncertainty. So it actually plays a psychological and clinical role in enabling people to make the leap into the unknown that is in a sense what creativity is all about. But you might be thinking, well, that's all very well, Lawrence, thanks very much for that, but I'm just not wired that way. I'm not an optimistic person. I know, oh, yes, should be, but I'm not. Well, actually, what I found was through Seligman, again, his research found that actually optimism is a muscle. I'd never thought about it that way. I thought that's really interesting. And what does he mean by that? Is it means it can be learned, it can be practiced by anybody, and it will grow and become easier the more you do it. And that made me think about, so what are the practical things that we can do to do that? So the first thing is to dispute and debate. And this is not about getting rid of the skepticism. Bad stuff will always happen, and we have a responsibility to share it and understand it, but also to interrogate it, to debate it, and to show. And that says, for me, exactly what news brands are all about. But Seligman said, dispute the negativity, use the evidence, stand up to a kind of a broad point of view and look at the nuances of it, and also feel energized in what it feels like to actually stand up to, a pessimistic viewpoint when you find it. And it struck me that actually a lot of the responsibility of brand marketing within the news brand context is almost to provide the optimism that sits within that context. So there's here's just a few ads that have run in all over the world, but it shows you that inherent in communication is an optimism, in building brands is an optimism, because what in essence are we doing? We're trying to sell people an ideal of their future that doesn't yet exist. It's inherently optimistic. So I thought that was quite interesting in terms of the relationship between editorial debate and editorial rigour and integrity, but also the role of us as marketers within that context is to provide a hope almost that there is a better world at a more individual level. And obviously that comes down to the quality of what we do as creatives and as brand owners and what we put into those spaces. The second thing we can do is increase the awareness of successes. And I mean, the times when news media has kind of outed the fakes or has challenged the status quo in a meaningful and as I say, rigorous way, but also where brands have actually changed the way people perceive things or the world or a particular brand through the success. So really just about making people more aware of the good things that are possible. But there's also this idea of tapping into the individual optimism. So you can see on the left-hand side there, if you ask somebody about their vision or their prospects for the country, say for the future, so if you ask a population, are things going to get better or worse next year for the UK? So at that macro level, you'll see there's all sorts of volatility and people tend to feel more often than not it will be the same or worse. But weirdly, if you look on the other side, you'll see if you ask somebody about how they feel about their prospects for the future for themselves at an individual level, there's this weird sort of stability of optimism. And what that says to me is that inside of us, each one of us is a private sort of wellspring of optimism that we can unlock. And if we can sort of unlock it at an individual level, we could almost create a global shift, one individual at a time. So we don't have to change the way people want to see the world or Brexit, but if we can make everybody that little bit more in touch with their own personal optimism, we might be able to make a bigger shift. And that certainly, to me, applies at a team level, if not at an organisational or industry. The next practical thing we can do is foster a culture of autonomy. So I don't know whether you're familiar with the analogy of the tethered elephant. So an elephant who is tethered as a calf is unable to pull itself out of the tether. But what happens is it learns helplessness. It learns that it's not able to pull itself out of the tether. Now, obviously, when it's a multi-ton adult male elephant, it would easily be able to pull itself out of a tether, but it doesn't do so because it's learned. And I think there's a great parallel for what we allow, how we develop our teams, for instance, and how we must allow people to have autonomy in the projects that they're doing and allow them to feel like they're in control of their own destiny. And I think the same is true of a readership. And I suppose this is where creativity actually can play a role. So, for example, this is a recent campaign, award-winning campaign for Budweiser. I don't know whether you're familiar, but basically the ads that are there shown on the left. So what it's asking you to do is Google those words, and what you find is this particular image. And there's a whole series of these. This type of creativity fosters the autonomy of the readership. So I go back to the point about questioning audiences. You want audiences reading your publications, wherever they are, who are questioning, who are part of that questioning culture, and to think for themselves. And this is a great example, and I thought this made me smile, so I thought I'd include this as well. This is the sort of creativity that treats the readership with some intelligence, with some resourcefulness, with some wit, and actually adds value to the experience of the interaction with that particular media form, which I think is, so powerful in the news brand context. So there's a real opportunity and an onus on us as brand owners and creative people to live up to that level of creativity, and not, I suppose, just become part of the noise. The next sort of practical step we can do is about fostering a culture of experimentation. I don't know how many times I've gone, oh, do you know what, I've read a case study or something, oh, that's a bloody brilliant idea, that I'm going to nick that and try that, and I suppose the onus on us all is to take ideas and not just try and replicate things that seem to work, but actually try and reinvent them. And there's, every day you're reading stuff and there's loads of nuggets and ideas that you think, oh, how can I apply that into my world? I suppose it's just to make sure that we're all thinking about what are we doing to reinvent. And in a culture of uncertainty, it's very hard to experiment. It's very hard to have permission to experiment, because what you're doing, you're opening yourself up for failure. And in an uncertain world, businesses don't want to spend money in uncertain ways. So, how do we foster a culture of experimentation that makes it okay to fail? Because otherwise we won't be creative, we will kill creativity, and we will not learn. And this is a great example of a business that it's an advert from the publication itself. It's used its media form, its truth of its and cultural truth of the media form itself to create this idea. Again, another piece of communication that treats its audience with some level of intelligence. But this is a brand that's experimenting with ideas. And finally, I'm a great believer that us as a nation, wherever we come from, have this unique, irreverent, creative spirit. And I thought this data was really interesting as part of that, which shows the number of book titles published per million inhabitants from 1500 to 2009. And it shows us that the people who live in this space have always had this innate curiosity for ideas. And I think we have to celebrate that. So when we're looking for reasons and excuses, I suppose, to be optimistic, this gives me great hope that the melting pot that is this country, no matter where you actually come from, that we have always encouraged ideas and we have always been hungry for new things. And I think that's something that you know, is part of what we need as we move forward. So Heraclitus, who was the guy who said the quote at the beginning, he also said this, and I think this is really true of marketing. You know, as marketers and builders of brands, we're here to try and change the way people see things, the world, themselves, and of course the brands. It is in changing that we find purpose. So we shouldn't be afraid of change. We shouldn't try and hide from change or build it into some sort of big deal that it isn't. Because I believe that our optimism as brand builders is not just important for us, it's precious and it's critical for the survival, not just of ourselves, but of, you know, positivity in the world at large, because, you know, when we get it right, we actually can change the world with our optimism.